I would like to introduce the featured speaker, the chair of the Japanese American National Museum Board of Trustees, Norman Mineta. Mr. Mineta was the first Asian American presidential cabinet member, serving in the cabinets of both President Clinton and President George W. Bush. He was the longest serving U.S. Secretary of Transportation and was in that post showing brave and thoughtful leadership during and in the aftermath of 9/11. Prior to his work under Clinton and Bush, Mr. Mineta served for 20 years in the U.S. House of Representatives. As a member of Congress, he was instrumental in securing passage of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which provided an official apology and reparations to the thousands of Japanese Americans who had been held in American concentration camp during World War II. We are indebted to Mr. Mineta for his outstanding leadership and his commitment to the museum. Please welcome Secretary Norman Mineta. Thank you.
Thanks, Koji. And I want to thank Harvard Law School, JABA, Japanese American Bar Association, and on behalf of JANM, for all of you to be participating here tonight. And to the panel, thank you very much. December 7th, 1941, without a doubt, is a very seminal moment in my life. And we had just come back home from church, turned on the radio and heard about the attack on Pearl Harbor. And then people started calling our home to find out what's the impact of what's happening in Hawaii on those of us of Japanese ancestry. And of course, all of you know the history of Executive Order 9066 being signed by President Roosevelt on February 17th, 1942, and the commanding general of the Western Civil Defense Command, John C. DeWitt, who had coined the phrase, once a JAP, always a JAP. And he figured that if they could attack Pearl Harbor, they could attack the West Coast. And what do I do with the 120,000 people in my jurisdiction of Washington, Oregon, and California who were of Japanese ancestry? So he took Executive Order 9066 and commandeered racetracks and county fairgrounds because they had built-in living quarters. And so probably by the 21st of February, these big placards would start getting posted on utility poles, sides of buildings, instructions to all those of Japanese ancestry, alien and non-alien. And I was a 10-year-old kid looking at that sign saying, what's a non-alien? And I asked my brother, who was 9 years older than me, he said, that's you, a citizen. I said, then why don't they call me a citizen? He said, probably some kind of psychological warfare. Now, I don't know when the last time any of you stood up on a chair, beat your chest and said, I'm a proud non-alien of the United States of America. I don't think you have. And that's why to this day, I cherish the word citizen, because my own government wasn't willing to use that word to describe those of us of Japanese ancestry. And then my brother, with whom I shared the bedroom in April of 43, was crying. I said, what's the matter, Al? He said, well, I've got my draft card, 1A, which is fit and able to serve. But I got this new one today, it's called 4C. So I just called the Selective Service Board to find out what 4C meant, enemy alien. So here is a kid who was born and raised in San Jose, now a sophomore at San Jose State College, wanting to become an MD. So let's fast forward to September 11, 2001. At that point, I was Secretary of Transportation for President George W. Bush. And I was having breakfast that morning with the Deputy Prime Minister of Belgium, who was also the Minister of Transport, and with Jane Garvey, who was the head of our Federal Aviation Administration. And while we were having breakfast, my Chief of Staff came in, said, Mr. Secretary, may I see you? So I said, obviously, okay, and I excused myself. Went from the conference room into my office. The other end of the conference room is a TV council, and you could see the World Trade Center with black smoke coming out. I said, John, what's that? He said, well, we don't know. We've heard the possibility of general aviation aircraft into the building, possibility of a commercial aircraft, or an internal explosion within the building. So I stood there watching, doing some channel surfing, and I said, I'm going to go back into the breakfast, so keep me posted. So I went in and I explained to Mrs. Durant and Jane Garvey, the head of FAA, what I had just seen on television. And about 7, 8 minutes later, John came back in, said, may I see you? So I went back into my office, and he said it was an American Airlines that went into the building. So I really started to channel surf and watch television. And as I was watching television, all of a sudden from the right side of the screen, this gray object came flying across the screen, disappeared, and then all of a sudden, white, yellow, orangey, billowy cloud from the left side of the screen. And I said, holy cow, what was all that about? Or words to that effect. And I really started watching and listening to the commentary. And after watching it for 5, 7 minutes, I went back into the conference room and I said, I don't know what's going on in New York, but Jane, you've got to get back to the operations center at FAA, and Mrs. Durant, I'm just going to have to excuse myself. So by the time I left the conference room, came back into my office, someone had called the White House and said, get over here right away. So I grabbed some government manuals and papers, threw them in my briefcase, went over to the White House. And as we're driving in West Executive Drive over at the White House, people running out of the old executive office building, people running out of the White House. And I said to my driver and security guy, is there something wrong with this picture? Everybody else is running away and we're driving in. So I got out of the car, went into the White House, and the guard said, Mr. Clark, Dick Clark, the security advisor to President Bush, is in the Situation Room waiting to brief you. So I went in there, and so he explained what was going on. And it wasn't much more than what I had already heard and seen on television. And then he said, you've got to be in the PEOC, Presidential Emergency Operations Center. And I said, I have no idea where that is. And he said, well, it's the bunker under the White House. And so there was a Secret Service agent standing nearby. He said, I'll take you down there. Well, this is called a PEOC, Presidential Emergency Operations Center, but it's advertised as being nuclear bomb-proof. So I hope we never have to test that capability of that PEOC. But I got down there, and the Vice President was already there. And there's a big, long table, about 40 feet long, chairs all around it with phones in between each of the chairs. So I sat in the middle of that table, set this line up to the Department of Transportation, said, don't hang up, keep the line open. This one I set to the Operations Center at FAA, don't hang up. And so started to get commentaries about what was going on. I also at that point pulled 3 people out of ACS, Aviation Civil Security. And I said, start putting together a new security regimen under which we will allow the airlines to go back into the air. Because that morning I had grounded everybody. And at that point we had 4,638 planes in the air over the United States. I also called the Minister of Transport in Canada and said, David, I need your help. And he said, well, we're watching what's happening. What can we do? I said, I've got planes coming in from Europe, planes coming in from Asia. Those that have not gone beyond the halfway point, we sent back to their port of embarkation. But the others have passed the halfway point. They're coming, and I don't want to take them in the U.S. Can you take them in Canada? So Canada has a privatized air traffic control system. So he said, let me put you on hold, and I'll get right back to you. So within a minute and a half or two, he said, we'll take them all. So we started the whole idea of security regimen. And on Thursday the 13th, we had a cabinet meeting with the House and Senate Democratic and Republican leadership. And towards the end of that meeting, Congressman David Bonnier from Detroit, Michigan said, Mr. President, we have a very large population Middle Easterners, Muslims in Michigan, and they're very concerned about all the rhetoric about banning Middle Easterners from flying, keeping Muslims off airplanes. And President George Bush said, David, you're right. We are equally concerned about the rhetoric in the electronic and print media, but we don't want to have happen today what happened to Norm in 1942. I mean, you could have knocked me off my cabinet chair with a feather when the president said that. So right after that cabinet meeting, I called the ACS staff and I said, how are you guys coming along on the new security regimen? So they went down the points, and the first one right at the top was no racial or ethnic profiling. And I said, well, you know, I may have some good news given what the president said this morning at the cabinet meeting. So by late that afternoon, we ran it by staff at the White House and the president. They signed off on that new security regimen. So here in my own lifetime, we had the largest profiling exercise of people who are by accident of birth of Japanese ancestry. No charges were filed, no court trials, but somehow we all ended up in camp for the duration of World War II. And now here I am on the 11th of September, hearing all this in the print, electronic media, and now being in a position where I might have some influence of what was going on. And it's amazing that here in 2001, given what happened in 1942, we were hearing all this. So it's something that all of us, and one of the things that I always felt grateful to the Japanese American community, there wasn't a lot of rancor and bitterness. Of course, there were people who were very upset about what happened. But the community came out of this with a very, very strong commitment that something like this should never, ever happen to anybody else again. And so I'm pleased to have Janum and Harvard Law and JABA help sponsor today's forum, because we have to keep talking about these things. And we have to keep reminding people that we don't have to be vigilantes, but we should really be vigilant in the protection of our own constitutional rights and helping each other out when these kinds of things surface. So thank you to the panel for being here tonight. And when you think about Mr. Olney's father and his critical role during that whole time in the 40s, we thank people like Mr. Olney, who was there and giving a different twist and guiding the administration at the time. So again, thanks to all of you for being here tonight. And thanks to the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Secretary Mineta, and thank you all for coming. I'm Judy Koffler. I'm the Public Interest Chair and Chief Mischief Maker of Harvard Law School Association. There's one other anonymous individual, an angel. I wanted to thank the one who has paid for the taiko drummers for tonight. We thank that angel. And I just want to very briefly introduce the panel and Warren Olney, known to most of you and known across the country. When my son's in Texas said, "Mom, you're talking with Warren Olney? We love Warren Olney." I said, "Oh, that's great. My star has just risen among my sons." But we all know Warren Olney from KCRW, from WWII LA, and from All Things Considered, and his To the Point. his daily program from what, 1 to 2 every day?
Yeah.
Right, Warren, thank you for that. He's gotten many, many awards. I'm not going to take up your time tonight, but you can find it all on the internet. But we're very honored to have him. He's the tops. The panelists, oh, yes, I also wanted to say thank you to, especially to Mike Madakoro of the Japanese American Bar Association. He is a partner at Bowman and Brook in Torrance, right, Mike? Thank you so much. And he's on the executive board of the Japanese American Bar Association as secretary and chair of JABA's Judicial Appointments Committee. Thanks again, Mike. I was asked to give just like a brief, Judy, why did you do this? Well, I come at this from being a very young law professor who has been choking on the Korematsu case for 30 years at least, and one who taught my students civil rights are nothing, nothing, nothing unless there are enforceable limits on power. And the Korematsu case is the only one. And before he died, Justice Scalia agreed it belongs in the Hall of Infamy of Supreme Court opinions as the only case that basically was a massive deprivation of the writ of habeas corpus, the guarantee of equal protection went out the window, due process went out the window, all based on national ancestry. Critical race theorists say we're not talking about race anymore, it's the human race, but national ancestry. And it is a conundrum to me that even today in constitutional law treatises of 800 pages, the mention of Korematsu is relegated to a tiny footnote. I also wanted to add that teaching constitutional law wasn't the only thing. I had a horror as a law student. This was, before most of you young folks were born, when we shut down the law school and marched on Washington to try to stop the Vietnam War. And I did that, but I also stayed behind and did research as a law review editor on the legality of the Vietnam War, and I started reading the congressional record. And I found an entry where one congressman said, well, what about those Japanese American concentration camps? Why don't we just put these dissidents on ice for a few years? There was one other horror, and that was right after 9/11, when I was in New York teaching law, and I had numerous colleagues who were also teaching constitutional law in New York City and the greater New York area. And right after 9/11, several of them said to me, we don't need a constitution anymore. We don't need civil rights. We need safety. So from such a background, including some recently leaked documents published in Politico magazine, which showed that in the 1980s, the Reagan administration had plans for massive detention of up to 5,000 Muslim Americans, legal aliens, in the backwoods of Louisiana and maybe Florida. Korematsu, the case, is very much with us, and it's very frightening. So I want to turn over the podium to Warren after I introduce our speakers, Karen Korematsu, whom I've adored and admired and has been an inspiration to me. She's Fred Korematsu's daughter. She's the founder and Chief Executive Officer of the Fred T. Korematsu Institute. Thank you, Karen, for coming. Irum Shiekh, who is a filmmaker, is at the University of Oregon, has published a book called Detained Without Cause, Muslim Stories of Detention and Deportation in America. She has also created a documentary film on the little-known kidnapping, massive kidnapping of some 2,000 Japanese Peruvians during World War I, and their incarceration They were never repatriated. They were massively deprived of their property. They were used as pawns. Thank you for coming, Irum Shiekh. And she's a civil rights activist and works all over the world. And Seema Ahmad, thank you so much for coming. She's chairman of the board of the Muslim Public Affairs Council. She's also a federal public defender. Not a prosecutor. And like me, she volunteered with the Center for Constitutional Rights and knows a great deal about the Guantanamo era. So without further ado, let me turn the podium over to Warren. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I just have a personal note. The secretary referred to my father, and Judith didn't know this when she asked me to moderate this panel, but I do have a connection to the internment, and it's this. In 1942, when Earl Warren was running for governor, and he was Attorney General at the time, and very much advocating in a public way the internment, and running for governor on that platform to a certain extent, I think. My father was one of his chief aides, and later in life, it fell to him in the Earl Warren oral history, which is a multi-volume work at the University of California Library, to explain, I won't say defend, but he had to explain why it was that they did what they did and urged the president to do what he did. It really was President Roosevelt, of course, that was in charge of the internment. And what's interesting about it, or at least somewhat encouraging about it, is that, of course, it wasn't that many years later that Earl Warren, as Chief Justice of the United States, became the great champion of civil rights, starting with Brown versus the Board of Education, a unanimous decision by a very divided court. Very important moment. At the time, my father had become the head of the criminal division in the first Eisenhower administration, and when the civil rights decisions started coming down, it was his idea to set up the civil rights division in the Justice Department. I'm proud to say that it was done. It was done at his suggestion and his urging, and he worked with Herbert Brownell, the Attorney General, and the President to see that it was done. And of course, that's become an extremely important institution in the enforcement of civil rights. He also wrote the first civil rights bill since the Civil War, which was in fact passed by the Congress in 1957. It was watered down, and it was a pale, not even a replica, I shouldn't say that, of the bill that was passed later in 1965, but it's regarded as its predecessor and perhaps a necessary predecessor. So I'm glad to say that both my father and Earl Warren in later life deeply regretted, I think, what they had done to deprive American citizens of their constitutional rights for no reason whatsoever, excepting for their national origin. But from my standpoint, being so close to it and having people that I love and my own father having gotten involved in the kind of situation that led to the internment, it's very clear to me that we really have to address this issue, and we have to keep addressing this issue. And I can't right the wrongs that have been done in the past, but I can certainly shed some light as a journalist, if I can, and hopefully to help others do the same, on the consequences of those mistakes. So I'm very privileged to be here, and wanted to make that very clear. And this is a wonderful panel, and we're going to have an interesting conversation, and I hope that it won't be entirely formal. Don't wait for me to call on you. If you want to call on each other or make comments or raise issues as we go along, please feel free to do it. But Karen Korematsu, why don't you begin and tell us a little bit about your father and how he resisted the internment, how he came in 1944 to reach the U.S. Supreme Court, and exactly what the Korematsu decision did and didn't do.
Well, thank you, Warren. And I also would like to thank JANM and the Japanese American Bar Association and Harvard Law School for hosting this discussion and forum, because my father believed in education, and he carried on with education after his conviction was overturned in 1983 because he didn't want something like the Japanese American incarceration to happen again. So just kind of briefly, for some of you that don't know, my father was born in Oakland, California in 1919, and he was the third son of 4 boys. My grandfather was Issei, first generation, and came over to America in 1905. I mean, actually, you know, a bit of the backstory, especially because of Warren's father and Earl Warren was had to do with economics and agriculture. And at the turn of the century, America went into, as they do in other countries, in this case Japan, to recruit cheap labor. And they went to the 5 prefectures or counties of Japan to recruit people like my grandfather to come to America, the land of opportunity, and you can do well here. And since the economy was so poor in Japan, it really to them was a true opportunity. And my grandfather worked first in the sugarcane fields of Kauai. And but it was like slave labor, and so he wanted to get out of there as fast as he could. So he came to San Francisco and was able to buy land before the Alien Land Law took into effect on August 10th, 1913, in an industrial area of Oakland. And my another part of the story, of course, if you go to JANM and to the museum, you can learn about picture brides because my grandmother was a picture bride. And but my father grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, like any other American kid. He loved hot dogs, hamburgers, hang out with his buddies, and so. But he did experience discrimination when he was in high school. He was refused a haircut when he went into another little town, San Leandro, by a Caucasian barber that said, get out of here, called him racist names, you don't belong here, go down to Chinatown, I never want to see you again. And he had that experience again when he tried to go to a diner to be served. And so, what's the message here? You do not look like us. You go down to where people look like you, because otherwise you don't belong in this neighborhood. And which unfortunately is now still happening. I mean, which is horrifying. And so at the timing of Pearl Harbor, he thought, well, maybe something might happen to my grandparents, his parents, because they were immigrants. They wanted to become American citizens, but couldn't because of the laws, and those didn't change until later. But he learned about the Constitution in high school. He thought he had civil rights as an American. So when all of these orders, when Executive Order 9066 was issued and exclusion orders to report to the horse stalls, to these detention assembly centers up and down the West Coast, he thought, well, why should he go? Because he had done nothing wrong. He didn't want to go to prison. And he had a girlfriend, an Italian-American girlfriend, which was another story. Not my mother, because if she were here, she would tell you she would have never deserted my father. But he decided not to go. And then he was about 30 days after everyone had reported, he was spotted in San Leandro, arrested, and put in a federal jail in San Francisco. And then one day, this man came to visit him, Mr. Ernest Bessick, who was the executive director of the Northern California affiliate of the ACLU, and was looking for a test case. And so he said to my father, would he be willing to challenge the government? And Mr. Bessick said that he would take my father's case all the way to the Supreme Court if need be. And my father thought, wow, by the time it got to the Supreme Court, certainly they would see that it was unconstitutional to incarcerate a whole group of people just because they supposedly look like the enemy. And so to fast forward, in 1944, it was not a unanimous decision. from the Supreme Court. It was a 6-3 decision, and one of the dissenters, dissenting opinions was Justice Robert Jackson, who referred to my father's Supreme Court case as "this lies around, ready like a loaded gun, ready for anyone to pick up and use with a plausible cause." And after 9/11, my father's Supreme Court case was cited as a possible reason to round up Arab and Muslim Americans and put them in American concentration camps.
Okay, and that, in fact, was done. Irum Shiekh, a filmmaker, has written a book called Detained Without Cause, Muslim Americans, Stories of Detention and Deportation After 9/11. So tell us now what happened, and who did you talk to, and what did they tell you?
Thank you, Warren, for the question. And again, before I start, I just want to acknowledge a lot of people who work behind the scenes to bring us together, and thanks to all of you for being here also. So before I start talking about the detentions of Arabs and Muslim-looking individuals, I want to backtrack for a minute and talk about my experience of working on civil liberty and civil rights issues before 9/11, which led me to do this work. So before 9/11, I was working with the Japanese-Peruvian Oral History Project and Peak Media to produce a documentary about Japanese Latin Americans. And the documentary's name is Hidden Internment, the Art Shibuyama Story. This documentary was both an educational and a political project, and it demanded equal reparations and apology, an official apology for Japanese who were brought over by the United States government from 13 different Latin American countries. And they were imprisoned with the Japanese Americans in the United States at the Department of Justice camps. So as I was working on that documentary to educate more American public about what happened during World War II and what one could characterize that internment and that imprisonment as an extraordinary rendition also because it was illegal without doing any judicial process. The governments brought these people, and this is not a story of one person, but about 2,000 individuals who were brought over here. 9/11 happened, and it was like deja vu. There were so many parallels of what happened after World War II to what happened with people who were my family. I am originally from Pakistan. My own brothers were investigated. One of my brothers is a pilot for the United Airlines. He was interrogated. FBI went to his home. His name and address was in the newspaper, and the newspaper claimed that the FBI found terrorist paraphernalia in his home. And that terrorist paraphernalia was spy novels written in Urdu, which is a Pakistani language. Along with that brother, I had nephews who were young men born in the United States, and they were interrogated. So I started to hear more stories of people being interrogated, questioned, and then detained. So it became like a natural step for me to conduct more research, hear their stories, find out what is going on. And so my book primarily concentrates on the 3 months after 9/11, when about 12 to 1,500 or about 2,000 individuals were detained. And one thing I like to mention that my brothers were not detained. And one of the major reasons was they were not detained, and the only comparison is that my family were citizens as compared to people who were detained. So number of people who were racially profiled and interrogated that number, there's no estimate to know. It could be 100,000, it could be million since 9/11 from here till now in the last 15 years. But the number of people who detained, we estimate, scholars estimate that number ranges from 15 to 20,000 people. The number of people who were detained right in the first 3 months of September 11th, we think about that number to be 1,200 to 1,500 or 2,000 people. And they people were vulnerable individuals, people with minor immigration violations, with expired visas. FBI racially profiled Muslim-looking individuals. So some of the individuals who looked brown could be Latinos, could be African Americans, could be anybody. They were questioned. But people who were then detained are the people, most of them were Muslims with minor immigration or minor criminal convictions, maybe credit card fraud, expired visa. And so conducting research and documenting their stories became a responsibility. I felt like I didn't have a way out. I had to do it.
And you talked to some people who had, in fact, been not just detained, but seriously abused.
Well, the 3 months after 9/11, as I mentioned to you, there were about 1,500 people who were detained, and there was no way to find out how they became suspect. And the FBI agents, and I talked to some of the FBI agents during my research also. Most of them didn't have any information about how to understand what is terrorism. That information is still unclear up until at this time. How to classify a person who's suspect. There was a rhetoric of wanting to arrest more and more individuals. So the US government, the way they did it, they racially profiled people, investigated them. If the individual had minor immigration violation, they were held and put in detention centers. Some of them, about 100 or 200 of them, were kept in a special housing unit, which was in New York, Metropolitan Detention Center in New York, where they were abused. The term that we can use is maybe the agents use is rough handling. You can understand what rough handling means for these security guards or by the other enforcement officials. They were kicked along the doors. Some of them were beaten. Some of them were actually beaten by the security guards also. And many of them were kept in solitary confinement. And they were framed as terrorists. And I personally interviewed many of these people, and I reviewed their legal documents, and the conversations that happen in the courts is about their immigration status. And it surprises me that how come the judges know that these people are labeled as terrorists. The conversation is about their immigration status, why they are not making a decision to tell the security guards they should not be treated as terrorists. Even somebody who's a terrorist, they have legal rights, they have human rights, they should not be violated. But these people, we sure know that we are dealing with immigration violations, why they are held up in solitary confinement. And there are lawyers and there are people constantly approaching these judges and asking them to remove them from solitary confinement, and nothing is being happened. And that's what I talk about, the climate of political fear, where independent thinking, when the judges, when the people who are supposed to be protecting our rights are refusing to do so. I can continue on.
Well, let me ask Seema Ahmad a couple of questions first, and let's try to get everybody into the conversation if we can. Seema Ahmad, you were a paralegal at the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York and focused on representation of detainees at Guantanamo. You know something about the way people are treated in prisons. You're also now a public defender. federal public defender in Los Angeles, and of course also the chair of the board of the Muslim Public Affairs Council. How do you answer the kinds of questions that, or how does the establishment, if I may, answer the kind of questions that Irum just raised?
Thank you, Warren, and thank you to all the organizers for putting this event together. I just want to say one word, which is, being here is really sacred ground as an American Muslim, because the Japanese American community was the first community to stand up for us after 9/11. So, Secretary, to you specifically, and to you specifically as well, I just want to say that the American Muslim community is indebted to the Japanese American community, really. Yeah. So to answer your question, Warren, one of the unfortunate parallels is the limitation of the limitation in getting legal redress for a lot of these issues. So to Irum's point, I'll just take us through one of the cases that the Center for Constitutional Rights brought, which Irum writes about in her book, Turkman v. Ashcroft. And that case is a class action case of non-citizen Arab, Muslim, South Asians who were detained on immigration, these minor immigration violations, indefinitely detained as a pretext for sort of this terrorism preventive detention system, and who were ultimately held in solitary confinement, beaten, held incommunicado, and then investigated under like a hold and clear policy, basically keep them in detention until they can be cleared and then deported. So there is a lawsuit that's been brought, and it's been in litigation since 2002. And what's happening with that lawsuit right now is there are these substantive legal and procedural bars that make it so difficult to receive a remedy for this type of violation. So one such doctrine is the doctrine of qualified immunity. So that lawsuit is a lawsuit against John Ashcroft and Robert Mueller from the FBI and Ziegler, who was the director of the INS at the time. And the Second Circuit Court of Appeals held a decision that said that this lawsuit can go forward and that qualified immunity cannot protect these federal officials. But now the Supreme Court has taken up the case and is going to be actually coming down with a decision on it in this next year. And the question may be whether or not these federal officials under this legal doctrine of qualified immunity can be protected from bearing responsibility for for their actions. So, and then, for example, another case is the case, some of you may have heard of the case of Meher Arar. Meher Arar was a Canadian citizen who was flying through to JFK back to Canada in 9/11, and he was intercepted by U.S. officials, and he was sent to Syria in a policy of extraordinary rendition, where he lived in an underground, grave-like cell for 10 months, and no charges were ever brought. There's been multiple admissions of his innocence. He had a case in the United States, and ultimately his case within the court system has stopped and ultimately was dismissed in part because of a doctrine called state secrets that the government can assert, which is that the very litigation of the case is so sensitive that it can compromise national security, and so it's a grounds for dismissal. And so the problem is in part that the legal recourse is takes a long time, and that there are all these sort of legalistic doctrines and procedural bars to getting remedies. And I think, that's part of the issue that is in common.
How great a problem is it when people are not citizens?
Right. I think I actually wanted to raise that question myself to Karen and to the secretary, which is this issue of could internment happen again, or can we turn around the Muslim American experience and the Muslim American narrative in this country? And one question that I have that I think is the difficult one to answer is, does it matter that the majority of the detentions happened with non-citizens in our case, as opposed to, I think, 2/3 of the internment of the Japanese Americans was U.S. citizens, and how that changes the narrative and the sympathy and the empathy that we can, garner for our issues.
So Karen, maybe you can clarify that to some extent because of the involvement with the people of Japanese heritage who were not citizens. Were they protected in any way, or have they been?
Well, you're correct. I mean, the 2/3 of the 120,000 people that were incarcerated were American citizens, and half were children, which is really appalling. You have to. I mean, you're comparing it to kind of now and to then. I mean, certainly, I would say people like my grandparents were, had legal papers, that made them illegal immigrants, that lived in this country. I mean, that's also a big issue, right? That especially undocumented, have even other issues other than just immigrants with, that have papers. I think with what's happening, today, it's part of it is the attitude also of and the targeting. It's the racial profiling that seems to be so much more intense than it used to be. It just seems to be, ramping up on an unbelievable scale. And, I wouldn't say that the Issei had it any easier, which is the first generation, like my grandparents. But I mean, certainly there wasn't, because they were in prison. I mean, they were in prison, and they definitely had no rights. They didn't know if they were going to be deported. That was their scare. They didn't know if they didn't know if they were going to be here in this country or if they're going to be sent back. They were just really unsure of their future. But I think now, especially with the way that the racial profiling has increased, it's made it much more of an intense situation and difficult for illegal immigrants, really, that are from the Amemsa community.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. I want to start by saying that one of the reasons that the United States government did not round up all the citizens, and the credit goes, as Seema mentioned, to the Japanese American political activism and the Reparation and the Civil Liberties Act that was passed in 1988. The government's apology and to say we will never or we won't do this again, I think set a precedent in some ways. So when 9/11 happened, they had to come up with a different strategy. And this strategy was, okay, what can we do almost the same, but using a different strategy? And so, okay, we cannot hold citizens, but we can hold people who may have a minor immigration violation, and sometimes those minor immigration violations were fabricated also. I mean, I know people who had valid visas or had even green cards, or in some situation, even they were citizens also, so that when the government has power, they can do anything and they can fabricate anything also. So in some situations, they did that too. But I think setting the precedent where they said, we will not do that to our citizens, required them to rethink about their strategies, and that strategy was focusing on undocumented immigrants because they could hold on to them for some reason. It was easy for them to do it legally. Up until now, the US government has refused to apologize for their actions about these people who were detained after 9/11.
Well, would it be politically possible to apologize, particularly when they are not citizens, given the what we read in the media, the kind of antagonisms and hostility that there has been generated against people? Could the government do that? It would take a lot of courage, it seems to me.
If I can jump in, I think that you're touching upon the political climate issue, which is a very serious issue. There was a case of a U.S. citizen who was Now, he couldn't have been detained on immigration violations. And so what the government did was they used this mechanism called a material witness warrant, which is a criminal justice tool that can be used to detain someone who is going to be a material witness in a case or before a grand jury. And he was that mechanism was improperly used against him, and he brought a lawsuit, and ultimately he settled it, I think, for somewhere around $400,000 in 2015. And the U.S. Attorney's Office wrote a letter to him and acknowledged the hardship that he had to go through in being detained improperly under this material, I wouldn't say improperly, but under the material witness warrant. And I wouldn't say improperly because the U.S. Attorney specifically in the media fell short of making it an apology and clearly stated it was an acknowledgement, but not an apology.
Why was he arrested and detained in the first place? What's the motive for the government picking him up and detaining him?
So he was detained on what's called a material witness warrant. So not because he himself.
What was he a material witness to?
So they were claiming that he was a material witness to a terrorism prosecution, but he never actually appeared before a grand jury. He was never called as a witness. It was, as Irum is saying, there are very few mechanisms really to detain U.S. citizens indefinitely on U.S. land, and so this was one that was potentially used to basically incapacitate him for 16 days, but he clearly wasn't ever intended as a material witness. He didn't appear before a grand jury. He didn't serve as a witness in a prosecution.
I completely forgot something, which is that we had agreed originally to have 3x5 cards passed out so that all of you in the audience could come up with questions. Do you have them? Were they handed out or not? You do have them. Okay, why don't you pass them over to the aisle, and maybe Judith will take a look at them, and we'll get you involved in this as well. Karen, let me go back to you. What does the Korematsu Institute do in this context to try to, I assume, prevent such things from happening again?
Well, that would be nice, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would be great. Well, I'm sure that's the goal of all
I
of
like
us
that
here.
optimism.
Yeah.
That's what we strive for. I actually established the Fred T. Korematsu Institute in 2009. Really, to honor my father, of course, but to carry on with his mission of education, and we focused. First, it was going to be more of a more of a local kind of youth-oriented, education program. But in 2010, when Governor Schwarzenegger signed the legislative bill establishing Fred Korematsu Day on January 30th, which is my father's birthday, in perpetuity, it changed the total focus of our work. And so the charge, even in the legislative bill, was education from K through 12. And so we developed these teaching kits that we now have lesson plans for elementary, middle school, and high school that to this date, we have impacted 6,000 classrooms, over 1 million students in all 50 states and 8 countries. And because even other countries look at the story of the Japanese American incarceration as a human rights story, as human rights violations, and which lends itself also to obviously what's happening today. So it's good that there is awareness, but I speak all over the United States to my age ranges from 5 years old to 100, but even in a focus group that I had with a youth group from the Japanese American Citizens League at a conference in Las Vegas, I said to them, well, what is it going to take? What do we need to do to make sure that the lessons of history are learned? And they said to start education at the elementary school level. And because obviously with the negative rhetoric that we've been hearing, especially during this presidential campaign, adults have their minds, it seems like, made up. And so the question is how are we going to change the hearts and minds of people? How are we going to make change? And if we don't start talking about these issues, to children, who clearly do understand that between right and wrong, that we aren't going to make any strides to make this world a safer place. I mean, I hope for children in the future that they don't have to confront all this war that is happening, or even terrorism, right? So unfortunately, what I say is that Korematsu versus the United States, that was, the decision was made in '44, is more relevant now than even it was then. And with the 75th anniversary of Executive Order 9066, which is next year, this is the opportunity to really bring focus, not to honor those people that, like my grandparents and my father's family that were incarcerated, but to make this an opportunity for education, because obviously we haven't learned the lessons of history. We need to keep learning and to keep reminding people, and at least now we have more organizations who will stand up, when the talk is to round up, people just because they of a certain religion or the way they look. Well, at least we have that, and the government is very slow, obviously. So it takes all of us, it takes all organizations to step up and say, no, we are not going to stand for this, and that we do need to apologize for the mistakes that we keep making.
Are you able to talk in your curriculum about what's happening now and about the fact that the same kinds of things are being done with Muslims that were done with Japanese Americans in the past? Can you do that? Are you allowed to do it, particularly in public schools? Or, once again, is there a political issue about it?
Well, we don't. We're nonpartisan, so we don't make it a political issue.
No, I don't mean political in the partisan sense.
But we do actually. What we do is we extend the curriculum to actually to include like the lessons of or what happened after 9/11 through some other curriculum that we've developed, through a graphic novel that talks about actually a Muslim little girl, American little girl after 9/11 who's bullied, because that's another issue that we have to address. And our goal is to really to tie in all these American civil rights hero stories together. Rosa Parks, Cesar Chavez, for Korematsu, Hirabayashi, Menyasui, because at the end of the day, we want children to know that they're Americans, right? That they are Americans and they have rights. And if we keep fragmented stories and just only focus on one, then we are not going to be able to change hearts and minds.
Irum, I think you wanted to be asked this question, and perhaps even to get people from the audience to respond to the same question, and that is, has all of this, particularly with regard now to Muslim Americans, has this changed the way that you identify yourself?
Right. I wanted to just share that before September 11th, I moved here into this country. I'm originally from Pakistan, 1983. And I did a variety of work. I was a graduate student at Berkeley doing my PhD in ethnic studies, and I was working on a variety of social justice issues. And we all carry different identities, and one of the identity most of the time would be Pakistani American. Muslim was not the primary identity. However, after 9/11, I noticed myself identifying more as a Muslim American, and other identities come wherever they need to. So I wanted to ask that question to the panelists and also to the audience. Maybe they can talk about it. Is there a shift in identity for any of you, all of us? And what may be the reason? What is the push behind it that may ask you to focus on a certain identity that you may have not thought about? And what's the political significance of that identity? That certain historic time or a certain kind of a trauma that forces you to take on a new identity. So it's a question for all of us.
Anybody want to respond to that, or shall we just go forward?
Well, I can mention one
Yes,
one
go ahead.
comment, Warren. I think it's a really it's a sentiment that resonates with me, Irum, and I can say that the organization that I'm the chair of, the Muslim Public Affairs Council, we're essentially an advocacy organization for the American Muslim voice through policy work, through media work, through community outreach. And what is interesting is we talk about the Muslim American identity and community, but one difference is that it's not a racial group, it's a religious group. And part of the beauty of the American Muslim community, but the difficulty of advocacy work is that there is a range of what it means to be a Muslim American, both internally for yourself and then externally how you're viewed by the government or by society or by non-Muslims. And I think that's one of the things that can be challenging as an advocacy organization. Obviously, if you're a part of a racial group, if you're, of Japanese ancestry, or if you are Black in this country, for the most part, you either are or you aren't. Maybe there's some things at the edges about being mixed race, but being a Muslim American, you can wake up one day and just say, I'm not a Muslim. But I think what Irum's point is the generation that came up after 9/11, whether you think you're a Muslim or not, whether you believe in God or not, whether you, pray, fast, care about what's written in the Quran or not, the country will see you as that. And that's part of the complexity of the identification of being Muslim.
So is this a very different experience then for a Muslim who is said to look like a Muslim or who wears a scarf or something of that kind, as opposed to somebody who's a Muslim from Bosnia? I would assume it's a very different kind of experience.
I think that, I can talk about myself, maybe to many I look very clearly Muslim, maybe to some I don't. And so the treatment can feel different than someone who wears a headscarf. But I think part of the identity issue is sort of what happens internally when you hear the rhetoric and you see what's going on, and then you feel that internally, whether you look one way or another.
Interesting question from the audience. What has been the role of foreign governments in the process of seeking release and reparations for their citizens who have been detained in the United States? Can you help us with that? Are you aware of any of you?
A good question, and it's an interesting question. I worked a lot in Pakistan because many of the people who were detained, they were from Pakistani background. They were also from Egypt. That was the second group of people. Turkey, Jordanians, these were the number of people. And I wanted to talk about the role of these countries and their relationship with the United States government. It's very unfortunate that they have not been very proactive in asking for and demanding that their citizens are released or demanding reparations for them. Many times they collaborated with the United States government and handed over their own citizens to be detained and kept in secret prisons. And some of them ended up then being at Guantanamo. So I would say we still have not seen a serious effort by especially these countries who are developing countries to do that. And they have not done. I was going to even talk about a case of Afia Siddiqui today, who was arrested. She's currently serving a life sentence here in Texas. That's only one case that I know where Pakistani government has been a little bit proactive and asking her release at a certain level, but not at the very top level. And she's a case where she was arrested in Pakistan. She's a Pakistani national. She disappears in the year 2003. She reappears in 2008 in Afghanistan. We don't know why she appears. Then she's blamed and kept and arrested for attacking a U.S. national and brought over here to to New York. And then she's tried and convicted, and eventually now she's serving a life in prison. Now, the Pakistani government in this situation may have asked to have her release, but that effort is not being accepted by the US government. But for the majority of the other people who were detained, Pakistani government, Egyptian government, Syrian government, there were some Syrians, Libyans, Jordanian, they have not been proactive. I would say they handed out their own citizens to the United States government, exactly like the way the Peruvian government and 13 other Latin American countries did that during World War II. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to, it's the US which works as an empire, and there's a national security has become an imperial discourse. So the US national security is so important that none of the national security of those countries and their citizens and their human rights matter. It's the US and their citizens and their certain citizens' human rights matter. Not everybody's human rights matter.
Another question about non-citizens. A person says that during World War II, some Japanese nationals who were barred by law from becoming citizens were protected under the Geneva Convention in Department of Justice camps like Crystal City in Idaho, I believe. In Texas, okay. I'm sorry, I'm having a little handwriting issue here. None of us writes the way as well as we used to. I know I don't either. Are non-citizens who are apprehended post 9/11 qualifying for POW protection under the Geneva Convention? Anybody address that?
No, that's part of the issue with Guantanamo that's now outstanding, that is part of the issue that the Obama administration is having, closing it and knowing what to do with dealing with the last 60 detainees who are there. There's been about 800 total who've passed through Guantanamo, is that the government took the position that these detainees didn't have Geneva Convention protections. And so part of what has now been difficult is that these individuals would be difficult to the extent that there's some subset of them that the government would be interested in prosecuting. The evidence obtained against them oftentimes was obtained through torture or coercion or through methods that would not be permissible in a federal court. And so that decision now to not apply the Geneva Conventions and to not give rights on the battlefields to distinguish between many of the detainees that we know now who were picked up essentially because the U.S. was paying bounties, sometimes in the amount of $25,000, and people were handing up, goat herders and foot soldiers. Though that decision is now part of the reason why it's become so difficult to close Guantanamo and know what to do with the remaining population there.
A lot of concern about, pardon me, about the internet and the kinds of things that circulate on the internet and how difficult it is to control it. Karen, I'm interested in you and your educational effort. To what extent do you find yourself trying to fight back against that? Because kids particularly are, it seems to me, subject to what they see on social media without context to help them with it.
Yes, bullying is such a major problem and an issue for social media. I mean, obviously, it's very difficult to control. So we're constantly trying to make people accountable, and social media is so new that there aren't really kind of the regulations that should be there to protect young people. it's that's why you have such a high rate for one reason or another of kids committing suicide by something that's said on social media. In talking to teachers, we're trying to develop more and more curriculum and lessons that address these issues. I mean, even when I was in elementary school, around the time of 9/11, or not 9/11, of the Pearl Harbor of December 7th, the teacher would throw up the picture of Pearl Harbor on the board, and then the kids would say, well, it was my fault for the bombing of Pearl Harbor. They would call me racist names. Go back to Japan. You don't belong here. It's it was always a time when I even made excuses to my mother not to ride the school bus. Like, mother, please take me to school, because I became very good at making up stories to make sure I didn't have to ride the school bus. But the teachers, here's the thing: the teachers were not really being responsible either about having the opportunity to bring up this discussion of, how do we treat people that their ancestry has come from a country that maybe has impacted ours in maybe in some negative way, or after 9/11. We're still, here we are, 2016, and 9/11 was in 2001. And it seems like we are not getting any better at trying to teach respect. And that's really what's lacking in schools and in society in general. To respect each other's differences rather than attacking somebody because they're Muslim, or they're black, or they're Latino, or whatever. It's or gay, right? So these are a kind of constant daily, like, getting up in the morning and figuring out how to have kids learn that they need to respect each other and our differences instead of attacking each other.
One note to that, Warren, if you don't mind. I just wanted to let the audience know, I don't know if you all heard, but the Islamic Center of Southern California is one of the oldest mosques in Southern California. It's in Koreatown at 4th and Vermont. And what happened just this week is there's an individual who called the mosque starting in September and sort of made general, left hateful messages. And then more recently, he actually made a specific threat to kill the staff of the Islamic Center. This is the mosque that the Muslim Public Affairs Council grew out of, that I grew up in. And so the LAPD got involved and investigated him and went to his house. He had 9 guns and 200 pounds of ammunition. And the recordings on the voicemail and on the Facebook essentially say, like, I'm going to kill all you guys are rats, F Muslims, this, that, and the other. And so he was just arrested stateside. The prosecution isn't federal, and I don't know what's behind that decision. But he was arrested stateside for criminal threats, and then they added, I think, a hate crime enhancement. So you talk about, terrorism and instilling fear in people and what that means and the whole cycle. It's just incredibly painful.
How do you reach the point at when you turn something like that over to the police? Because you don't want to get people in trouble any more than if they're innocent and if they're just sounding off for some sort of reason, I presume. But what standard do you use at what point? And how difficult is it then to get the police to actually go do something?
So at this, my understanding is that he had left messages in September that were sort of generally hateful, and this is a sad thing to say, but I think the Islamic Center gets those types of messages somewhat regularly. And what happened that caused the police intervention is that it was a more specific, I think when he said, I'm going to kill all of you, that's when legalistically it kind of, it gets transferred into something that's actionable as a prosecution. But to your point also, Warren, the issue about people that are innocent, one of the things that we have to deal with at the Muslim Public Affairs Council as part of our policy work is how we engage with the government on issues of national security and civil liberties. Even though that's not really what our community is fully about, that's the lens through which we're viewed, and that's the lens often that many government officials want to interact with us. And so one of the recent struggles was there's a government program called Countering Violent Extremism. And originally it was sort of focused just on Muslims, and now they've expanded it to talk about white supremacy groups as well. But one of the programs that the FBI wanted that MPAC pushed back on is this thing called shared responsibility committees. And what the FBI wanted was they wanted American Muslim like educators and social workers and counselors to sort of be deputized to go out into the community and talk to individuals who may be targets of investigations. And unfortunately, it maybe potentially sounds good in theory, but these individuals, it would essentially be kind of expanding the network of the FBI to kind of have informants at various places, yet these individuals would not be protected from, if they end up being called as witnesses themselves, or if individuals end up getting scooped into an investigation. And so that line between law enforcement and the community is a constant one that we're struggling with as the American Muslim community. And I think part of the difficulty too is, even Hillary Clinton's rhetoric, which has been generally, I think, positive when it comes to the American Muslim community. I think in recent debates, her sort of position is we need American Muslims to be on the front lines of terrorism. And we're sitting in our living room like, we don't know any terrorists. We don't even know what that means. And yet that's the lens through which we're viewed. And so one of the struggles as an advocacy organization is how much do we engage that, because that's our kind of the way in which we're viewed as far, and then how much do we reject that, because I don't know, 99.9% of our community would never know what it means to be on the front lines of terrorism.
Go ahead, Irum.
Can I ask a question about the organization? So as an organization or as a Muslim organization, what are some of your organization's priorities for American Muslims and for the larger communities living in the United States? Like, what are their priorities, and then how maybe the government priorities try to reshuffle some of those priorities that maybe the organization have?
Right. So the way I can describe MPAC's work is largely sort of on three prongs. We engage government and we engage policy work, and unfortunately right now that's largely on issues of national security and civil liberties. Apart from that, we do leadership development, and so we have programs for young American Muslims to be interns on Capitol Hill, to go into Hollywood, and to really sort of develop their talent as young American Muslim professionals. I would say the third prong is the work that we can really do that's affirmatively on our own terms, which sort of generally speaking is promoting American Muslim narratives. And so really all of it is with an eye towards elevating, the richness of the American Muslim community and moving away from, traditionally how we've been seen for the last 15 years and even before that.
I wanted to ask a question, Seema, regarding children. You were talking about the shared responsibility. Was that an organized effort for your community to work with teachers, or?
No, so this shared responsibility committees was actually something we pushed back on, and ultimately the FBI abandoned, and several other Muslim organizations that are civil liberties organizations pushed back on it as well. And what the FBI wanted was that counselors and religious leaders and health workers would sort of be deputized to talk to young people and essentially investigate individuals who may be disaffected and, I guess, in theory, end up committing some sort of crime. Oh. But it was a problem for our community because that's a very, sort of tenuous position to be vis-a-vis law enforcement.
Oh, so as more investigation, I was thinking of kind of an opportunity for education, right, to do more outreach from the community, and because teachers constantly need teacher development. They need educating as well, I mean, you have to educate the teachers so they can educate the students. And if your message isn't clear, if you don't have kind of the right type of curriculum, I mean, this is kind of our constant struggle because, you know, all of the states are mandated kind of more towards teach to test, right? So then, you know, you were talking about, Warren, earlier about the curriculum. It's a really big push, and one reason why we send out our teaching kits for free is so that there isn't any pushback from you know, school districts or from states or whatever to you know, say, well, we can't afford the materials. But you know, we're always trying to figure out, you know, I mean, when I've been involved in press conferences when we've had community leaders up in the Bay Area saying, you know, the kids are saying they don't want to go to school because other students have told them that ISIS is going to come and get them. You know, they're afraid, and that's not right. And so it's, you know, we are constantly trying to have, you know, have kids, you know, have the opportunity to speak up and not be afraid. And you know, the opportunity that we try to use is in going back to Korematsu versus United States. We're finding is in high school standards. And so to take that as an opportunity to teach the lessons of not only that time of the Japanese American incarceration of World War II, but how it relates to our issues today.
I have one more question that goes back to the issue of the internment itself, and it's this. Is it true that a lot of the people were reluctant to leave the camps when they were able to do that and they could have lawfully left? Have you personally interviewed people like that and found out why that might be the case?
Well, I can tell you it was more had to do with my grandparents' generation, especially with the East Side generation, who had built up businesses and in some cases, you know, they had nothing to go back to. I mean, they were really afraid that there would be nothing there. I mean, fortunately, my grandfather was able to get back his land because a Portuguese immigrant banker had taken care of it, and paid the taxes. And in some cases, taxes weren't paid on any property, so it was taken away from them. So to me, that was outrageous. Well, the government, you know, it has put you in prison, so how do you have the ability to pay, you know, property taxes? But those were mostly the people that were reluctant to leave because they didn't have any place to go. That's why people ended up going back east I say back east or the Midwest. I mean, after my father's Supreme Court case was reopened in '83, I started meeting people because we weren't part of the Japanese American community growing up. My father had been ostracized and vilified. So up until that time, you know, I didn't know very many people. And I would meet somebody from Minnesota who is Sansei, third generation like me, and I would say, well, how did you get to Minnesota? It's cold there. You know, I grew up in California, and they would say, well, it's because, you know, if they could leave the incarceration camp early because there were jobs, some of the community people came in, and you could go east before the end of the war and not west. Then that's where they went to. I mean, they didn't, you know, like my father, he didn't think he'd ever come back to California. You know, he didn't have anything to come back to. But the only reason he did come back was because my grandmother wasn't well. So that's the stigma. And also, when people left the incarceration camps, you know, they were given $25 in a bus ticket, and that was it. And you had to start all over again.
We have pretty much come to the end of our time, and I know there are airplanes to be caught and things of that kind. Let me ask you all if you'd just like to say anything in closing. And Seema, let me start with you.
Thank you, Warren. It's been a wonderful discussion, and I really appreciate everyone's questions. You know, I'm hopeful that we can get to a better place. Things are pretty dire right now. In some ways, it feels worse now than it did in the months and in the immediate years after 9/11. And I guess the question I have is, is the pendulum going to swing the other way? And I'm hopeful we're going to continue fighting on the front lines for that.
Seema Ahmad, again, with the Muslim Public Affairs Council, the chair of the board, also a federal public defender. Dr. Irum Shiekh, what about you?
Listening to Secretary Mineta, I have been thinking that we need more people in these public offices. So I want to work. I'm glad that your organization is doing it. I want more people to be in those places, people with our background. So when anything happens, and right now it's the people of Arabs and Muslims or Muslim-looking individuals, but things are going to change. Like at one time it was Japanese Americans, and it was Chinese Americans. At one time they were communist. Now it's Arabs and Muslims. I don't know who's going to be next. We need to enlarge that group of people who are sitting in the White House and making decisions about us, about all of us. And I want more of us to be at that location so they can hear that sound, and then they can see and they can relate to people like us. Otherwise, it just becomes them versus us. And I think that boundary needs to be blurred. That needs to become much more gray than what it is right now.
Irum Shiekh again, Detained Without Cause, Muslim Americans, Stories of Detention and Deportation after 9/11. Karen?
Yes, you are absolutely right. When my father spoke all over the United States, he was always promoting, civic engagement, because he was part of, after his conviction was overturned in 1983, which helped set the precedent for the signing of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. He was part of that group that lobbied in Washington, D.C. And when Secretary Mineta was in Congress, my father said it was because we had Japanese Americans that were in Congress that we were able to succeed with the Civil Liberties Act, because they told their stories on the congressional floor. I mean, other congressmen were just in tears hearing these stories of people being stripped of their dignity, the losses. In a lot of cases, we treat animals better than we treated the Japanese Americans and people like my grandparents during World War II. So you are right. If we have more, of the MEMSA community and even Latino, African American community to represent us in Congress, if Congress could ever get it together, by the way, then hopefully we would make a little bit more difference, because that's the whole point of Congress, is to have representation, true representation of your community, and so I encourage people and even students to be civically engaged. I'll just tell you just a real quick story. We have Fred Korematsu Day, as I said, in California and Hawaii, the Commonwealth of Virginia, for goodness sakes, who is more conservative. So that's a miracle. And in Florida, there is it's a middle school. It's the Clearwater Fundamental Middle School. These seventh graders, unbeknownst to me, their teacher was telling them about Fred Korematsu. And they Googled Fred Korematsu, and they found out, oh, there's a day, a special day. Well, I think more so they wanted a special holiday, but they had a state senator come and visit them, and they said, well, we want a Fred Korematsu Day for the state of Florida. He said, well, you write me letters, and he created a legislative bill. He took it back to the Florida State Senate. It passed. He had a colleague that took it over to the House. It passed, and because of the power of the students, of their civic engagement, we now have Fred Korematsu Day for the state of Florida in perpetuity. So, you know, we have to get our young people also involved, that they can make a difference. And so we to encourage them and in a positive manner.
Well, thank you all. Thanks to the Harvard Law Association, to the Japanese American National Museum, Secretary Mineta, it's great to have you here, and thanks to all of you very much for a great conversation.